Marcus Bellamy had already signed his name on the first page of the divorce petition. What he didn't know was that in 20 minutes, a single overheard conversation would make him tear that document into pieces. 12 years of marriage had brought him to a lawyer's waiting room and to the edge of a decision he believed was final. He was wrong about almost everything. Before we begin this story, if you believe that the truth about the people we love is often hidden in the quietest of moments, take a second to like this video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about how close two good people came to losing each other over things left unsaid. Now let me take you back to the beginning of the worst month of Marcus Bellamy's life. Marcus was 41 years old, a structural engineer who had spent 2 decades making certain that buildings would not fall. He understood load and stress and the invisible forces that pull a thing apart. From the inside, he could look at a bridge and know within a margin exactly how much weight it could bear before it failed. And yet he had spent the last several months entirely unable to read the woman he had shared a bed with for 12 years. Elena, his wife, had become a stranger in their own home. She left the house early and returned late. She took phone calls in the garage with the door pulled halfway down. She had stopped meeting his eyes across the dinner table, and when he asked her what was wrong, she said the word nothing in a voice that meant everything. They had married when Marcus was 29 and Elena was 27. He remembered the exact weight of the day, the way the light had come sideways through the church windows, the way her father, a hard and silent man named Theodore Marsh, had shaken his hand and said only, "Take care of her," as though issuing a warning rather than a blessing. Marcus had spent 12 years trying to earn the approval that Theodore never quite gave. He had built them a good life, a modest house that he had reinforced and improved with his own hands, a savings account that he added to quietly every month, a daughter, Sophie, now 10 years old, who had her mother's stubborn chin and her father's habit of asking why about everything. But something had cracked, and Marcus, the man who understood failure in structures better than anyone, had convinced himself the marriage was beyond repair. It had started with the small distances and grown into a canyon. Elena flinched when he touched her shoulder. She whispered on the phone. Twice he had seen a name he didn't recognize light up her screen. A man's name, Julian, and when he asked about it, she said it was work and turned away. Marcus was not a jealous man by nature. He was a patient one, but patience, when it is fed, only silence curdles into suspicion, and suspicion, left alone in the dark, grows teeth. So, on a gray Tuesday in October, without telling Elena, Marcus drove to the office of a divorce attorney named Patricia Vance. He sat in a chair that was too soft and listened to her explain the mechanics of ending a life together. Assets. Custody. The house. She slid a preliminary petition across the desk and told him to read it, to think, to sign only when he was ready. And Marcus, feeling as though he were watching himself from a great height, had picked up the pen and signed the first page. Just the first page. His hand had shaken. The name looked like a stranger's name. Patricia had asked him to leave the document with her office to be finalized, and Marcus had agreed. He had walked out into the cold with a hollow place where his certainties should have been. Well, he told himself he was doing the responsible thing. A man does not cling to a marriage that has already ended in everything but paperwork. A man faces reality. But the truth, the one he would not admit even to himself, was that he was terrified, because he still loved her. He loved her the way he loved the first building he ever designed, with a fierce and helpless attachment that no amount of logic could dissolve. That evening, Elena told him she was taking Sophie to her father's house for the weekend. Theodore Marsh lived alone now, a widower, in a large old house on the edge of town, and Elena visited him often. Marcus was not invited, which was not unusual. The two men had never learned how to be in a room together without the air going thin, so Marcus said, "Fine," and he watched his wife and his daughter drive away, and he told himself that soon this would be his life, weekends alone. A daughter shuttled between two houses. The slow amputation of a family. He might have left it there. He might have let the petition proceed, and the story would have ended in the quiet, grinding way that so many marriages do. But on Saturday afternoon, Marcus realized that Sophie had left her inhaler on the kitchen counter. She was asthmatic, and the autumn air was thick with dust and dying leaves. And Marcus was not a man who could sit in a house knowing his child might need something she did not have. So he picked up the inhaler and he drove the 40 minutes to Theodore Marsh's house, intending to hand it over at the door and leave. The house was set back from the road, surrounded by old oaks. Marcus parked at the bottom of the long drive rather than announce himself with headlights. The front door was slightly ajar, propped by the autumn heat, and as he approached, he heard voices coming from the study window, which was open a few inches to the evening. He heard his wife's voice, and he heard his own name. And Marcus Bellamy, the man who was about to end 12 years of marriage, stopped where he stood in the gathering dark, and he listened. What he heard would unmake every conclusion he had reached. The first thing Marcus heard was his father-in-law's voice, low and gravelly, carrying that same edge of judgment it had always carried. Theodore was speaking, and his words landed on Marcus like stones. "You've been carrying this for months, Elena. It isn't fair to you. Whatever else that man is, he's got a right to know. And you've got a right to stop pretending. Everything is fine." Marcus felt his stomach drop. So it was true. There was something she had been hiding, some secret at the center of all those whispered calls and averted eyes. He pressed his back against the cold brick of the house and made himself breathe. He had come all this way to confirm the thing he already believed. He was going to hear his marriage confirmed dead in his wife's own voice. Then Elena spoke, and her voice was not the voice of a guilty woman. It was the voice of a woman on the edge of tears. "Dad, you don't understand. I can't tell him. If I tell Marcus, he'll do exactly what he always does. He'll try to carry all of it himself. He'll take on the debt, the appointments, the worry, everything. And he'll never once let me see how scared he is, and it'll break him, and then it'll break us. That's what I'm afraid of. Not that he doesn't love me. I know he loves me. I'm afraid he loves me too much to let me protect him for once." Marcus stood very still. The word debt echoed in his skull. The word appointments. This was not the vocabulary of an affair. This was the vocabulary of something else entirely, something he had not imagined in any of his dark and lonely scenarios. He leaned closer to the window, the inhaler forgotten in his fist, and he listened harder than he had listened to anything in his life. Theodore's voice came again, softer now, almost gentle, which was itself a shock, because Marcus had never once heard the man speak gently. "Elena, sweetheart, you've been driving to the city 3 days a week. You've drained your own savings account, the one your mother left you, down to almost nothing. You've been telling your husband you're at work when you're sitting in a waiting room. How long do you think you can keep this up before he stops believing it's work and starts believing it's a man? Because that's what a husband thinks, Elena. When his wife whispers on the phone and empties her accounts and won't meet his eyes, he doesn't think she's dying. He thinks she's leaving, dying." The word went through Marcus like a blade of cold water. He gripped the windowsill. He must have made a sound because for one terrible moment, the voices inside paused. But then Elena spoke again, and Marcus stopped breathing. Entirely. "I'm not dying, Dad. Please don't say it like that." The doctors caught it early. Stage 2. The oncologist says the treatment plan has a very good chance, better than 80%. But it's aggressive, and it's expensive, and the insurance only covers part of it, and I didn't want Marcus to have to choose between saving my life and Sophie's college fund. So I've been paying for the extra treatments myself, out of Mom's money, and I've been going alone, and I've been telling him it's work, and I know It looks like the worst thing in the world. I know. It looks like I'm having an affair. Sometimes I think it would almost be easier if I were, because at least then he could be angry at me. Instead of watching me disappear, Marcus's knees nearly gave way. He slid down until he was crouched beneath the window, his back against the brick, the inhaler pressed against his chest. His wife had cancer. His wife had been driving alone to chemotherapy for months. Every whispered phone call was an appointment. Every drained account was a treatment she had paid for, so that he would not have to sacrifice their daughter's future. The name Julian, the name that had lit up her phone and set his mind on fire, was almost certainly the name of a doctor. And while she had been fighting for her life in silence, terrified and alone, Marcus had been sitting in a lawyer's office, signing his name to a document that would leave her. The shame that flooded him was so total that he thought he might be sick. He thought of every cold conclusion he had reached. He thought of the petition sitting in Patricia Vance's office, the first page bearing his shaking signature. He had been so certain of his own suffering that he had never once imagined hers. He, who prided himself on reading the invisible forces that pull a structure apart, had completely misread the woman he loved. He had seen distance and called it betrayal, when it was really terror, wearing the mask of protection. Inside, Theodore was speaking again, and now his voice had returned to its old hardness, but it was aimed in a direction Marcus did not expect. And I'll tell you something else, Elena. You married a good man. I never said it to him because I'm a stubborn old fool who thought no one was ever good enough for my daughter. 12 years I made that man work for a nod he never got. And now you're telling me he's the kind of man who would carry your whole burden on his own back without complaint, and you're protecting him from the chance to prove it. You're robbing him of the one thing a good husband wants more than anything, which is to stand beside his wife when the ground is falling away. You need to tell him, not for your sake, for his. There was a long silence. Marcus heard his wife crying, a small broken sound, and it took everything in him not to stand up and go through that door and hold her, but he could not move. He was pinned to the ground by the enormity of his own error and by a fierce rising love that had nowhere yet to go. Elena's voice, when it came, was thin. What if I tell him and he sees me differently? What if he starts looking at me like I'm already gone? I couldn't bear that, Dad. I'd rather have his frustration than his pity. At least his frustration means he still sees me as his wife and not as a patient. Theodore said, Then you don't know your husband as well as I've started to. And in the dark beneath the window, Marcus Bellamy silently swore that his father-in-law was right and that he would spend whatever time they had proving it. Marcus rose to his feet on legs that did not feel entirely his own. Every instinct told him to go straight through that door, but a deeper instinct, the same one that made him check a structure 3 times before he trusted it, told him to wait. If he burst in now, wild-eyed and shaking, Elena would know he had been listening at a window. She would feel exposed, stripped of the choice to tell him herself. And he understood now that the choice mattered to her enormously. She had built her whole terrified strategy around control, around protecting him, around being the one who decided how the truth would land. To rob her of that would be to prove exactly the thing she feared, that he would take over, that he would carry it all, that he would not let her have any dignity in her own suffering. So Marcus did the hardest thing he had ever done. He walked quietly back down the drive to his car. He set the inhaler on the passenger seat. And then he sat in the dark, and he wept, openly, the way he had not wept since he was a boy, for the months his wife had faced alone, for the cruelty of the conclusions he had drawn, for the document with his name on it that now felt like the most shameful thing he had ever done. He wept until he was empty, and then he wiped his face and he began to think, the way an engineer thinks, about how to hold up a thing that is falling. He drove home. He did not call. He spent that night and the whole of Sunday doing 3 things. First, he called Patricia Vance's emergency line and left a message that he would be terminating the divorce process entirely and to please shred the document, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. Second, he opened his laptop and he began to learn. He read everything he could find about Elena's likely condition, about the treatment protocols, about the side effects, about what a patient going through aggressive treatment actually needed from the people around her. He read about how the worst thing a caregiver could do was hover, or pity, or take over a person's autonomy. He read until 3 in the morning, filling a notebook, because if he was going to stand beside his wife, he was going to do it properly, the way he did everything, with knowledge and preparation and quiet strength. And third, he looked at their finances with clear eyes. He saw now the withdrawals from Elena's inherited account, the money her late mother had left her, drained month after month, to pay for treatments she had refused to let touch their shared life. He felt the full weight of what she had sacrificed to protect Sophie's future and his peace of mind, and he made a decision. He would quietly refill that account, not to erase what she had done, but to honor it. He had a savings account of his own, built over 12 years of overtime and careful living, more than enough to cover the treatments that remained. Elena had never known its full size, because Marcus was a private man about money, and now he was fiercely glad of it. There would be no choosing between her life and Sophie's college fund. There had never needed to be. He had simply failed to tell her about his savings, the same way she had failed to tell him about her diagnosis. Two people who loved each other, each hiding their strength to protect the other, each nearly destroying everything in the process. On Sunday evening, Elena and Sophie came home. Marcus met them at the door. He hugged his daughter and handed her the inhaler and told her he'd noticed she left it, that he'd almost driven it up to Grandpa's, but figured she'd manage a couple of days. He watched Elena's face carefully as he said it and saw a flicker of something, and he understood that she was wondering, calculating, and so he let it go easily, casually, and the flicker passed. Then he made dinner, all of Elena's favorites, and he asked her about her weekend, and he did not interrogate, and he did not accuse, and he was so gentle with her that she looked at him strangely across the table, as though she were seeing a man she did not quite recognize. That night, lying beside her in the dark, Marcus did not push, he waited. He had decided that he would give her every opening in the world, and if she still could not find the words, then, and only then, would he find his own way to let her know that she was not alone, that she had never been alone, that she had only believed she was. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and he did not let go, and he felt her go, still with surprise, and then he felt her fingers slowly close around his. The days that followed were a study in patience. Marcus, who had spent months growing colder, now became warmer than he had been in years, and it confused Elena visibly. He came home earlier. He took over the harder household chores without being asked. When she said she had to work late again on Thursday, he did not stiffen or ask pointed questions. He simply said, "Drive safe," and made sure there was food waiting. When she returned, exhausted, her skin gray, her eyes ringed with shadows, he now understood. He watched her push food around her plate and lose her appetite, and it took everything in him not to say, I know, let me help you." But he had read enough to understand that his knowing had to arrive on her terms, or it would wound her. Still, he found quiet ways to lighten her load. He noticed she had been wearing headscarves more often, and one evening he came home with 3 new ones, beautiful silk ones in colors he knew she loved, and he simply said he'd seen them and thought of her. She held them in her hands, and her eyes filled, and she said, "Why would you buy me these?" And he said, "Because you're beautiful, and I don't tell you enough." She turned away, but not before he saw that she was crying, and that night she held on to him in her sleep with a desperation that broke his heart. He quietly moved the money. Through his own bank, over the course of a week, he restored Elena's inherited account to what it had been before the treatments began, structuring it so the deposits appeared as a maturing investment her mother had apparently set up years ago. a small deception designed only to spare her the shock of realizing he knew. He was not certain she would notice right away, but he wanted the safety net to be there. He also discreetly called the billing department of the oncology center, having found the name on a crumpled receipt in the car, and arranged to cover the outstanding balance and the projected costs of the remaining treatment, again without his name attached in any way that would alert her. He told the billing coordinator that he was the patient's husband and that under no circumstances was his wife to be informed, that she would be told simply that her insurance appeal had been approved. Money, for once, made something easier instead of harder, but money was the easy part. The hard part was the waiting and the watching and the loving in silence. Marcus began to understand what Elena had endured, this business of carrying an enormous truth while performing ordinary life, of smiling at your child while your body wages a private war, of climbing into bed beside your spouse and choosing, again and again, not to speak. He understood now that her silence had never been coldness. It had been the loneliest kind of courage. And every day that she carried it alone was a day he had to bear, knowing he could end it, and choosing, out of love, to let her reach the moment herself. Theodore called him. That was itself a small earthquake, because in 12 years his father-in-law had never once telephoned him directly. The old man's voice was gruff and awkward. "Marcus, it's Theodore. I wanted to." He cleared his throat. "I wanted to see how things are." Marcus understood immediately that this was Theodore's way of checking whether Elena had told him, perhaps of nudging events forward. Marcus made a decision in that instant. He said, "Theodore, I came up to bring Sophie's inhaler on Saturday, and I heard you both through the study window. I know everything, and I haven't told her. I'm waiting for her to tell me, because I think she needs that. But I wanted you to know that she is not alone, and she never will be. And I'm sorry it took me this long to become the man you were hoping I'd be." There was a long silence on the line. When Theodore spoke again, his voice was rough with something Marcus had never heard from him. "I was wrong about you, son, all these years. I was wrong." And Marcus, holding the phone, felt 12 years of withheld approval arrive all at once, and it undid him a little. Then Theodore said, "Don't wait too long. She's stubborn. She might carry it to the end, just to keep from burdening you. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let a person be found out." And Marcus understood that the old man was giving him permission, and perhaps instruction. That night, Marcus knew the waiting was over. Not because he had run out of patience, but because he had come to see that his silence, however loving, had become its own kind of hiding, and he was done hiding. Marcus chose a Sunday morning. Sophie was at a friend's house. The autumn light came sideways through the kitchen windows, the same quality of light he remembered from their wedding day, and it felt like a sign, though he was not a man who believed in signs. Elena was at the table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. Marcus sat down across from her and took both her hands in his, and he said her name so gently that she looked up, alarmed. "Elena," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. A few weeks ago, I did something I am more ashamed of than anything I have ever done. I went to a lawyer. I signed the first page of a divorce petition. I believed you were having an affair. I believed our marriage was over. I was wrong, and I was a fool, and I nearly threw away the only thing that has ever mattered to me because I was too proud and too frightened to simply ask you what was wrong." Elena's face had gone white. Her hands trembled in his, but he held them fast. He went on the day I drove Sophie's inhaler up to your father's house, I heard you through the study window. I heard everything, Elena. I know you're sick. I know about the treatments and the driving and the money and the appointments. I know you've been fighting for your life alone for months because you were trying to protect me and Sophie. And I have spent every day since then loving you more than I knew it was possible to love a person, and hating myself for every cold thought I ever had." Elena made a sound, half sob and half gasp. and tried to pull her hands away, but he would not let her. "Please," he said, "please don't be ashamed. There is nothing to be ashamed of. You are the bravest person I have ever known. But I need you to hear me now. You do not have to protect me. You never did. I am your husband. Standing beside you when the ground falls away is not a burden you are placing on me. It is the entire reason I exist. When I married you, I promised in sickness and in health, and I meant it, and I mean it, now more than I did on the day I said it, because now I actually understand what those words cost." She was crying openly now, her whole body shaking, and finally the words came out of her in a flood. "I didn't want you to see me disappear. I didn't want you to have to choose between me and Sophie's future. I emptied my mother's account. I was so scared. Every time I drove to the city alone, I would sit in the parking lot, and I would think, my husband thinks I'm cheating on him, and I would let him think it, because the truth felt too heavy to hand to another person. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I made you feel unloved." Marcus came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her whole trembling body into his arms. "You didn't make me feel unloved," he said into her hair. "You made me feel the way you must have felt every single day, alone with something too big to say. And we're done with that now, both of us." Then he told her the rest. He told her about his savings account, the one she had never known the full size of. He told her that there would be no choosing between her treatment and their daughter's future, that there had never needed to be, that he had quietly cleared the balance at the oncology center and restored her mother's money. He watched the disbelief cross her face, and then the relief. A relief so enormous that it seemed to physically lift years off her, and she wept against his chest, and he held her, and for the first time in months, the house did not feel like it was falling down around them. "You did all this," she whispered, "and you didn't say anything. You just waited. Why?" And Marcus said, "Because I did the same thing you did. I hid my strength from you because I thought I was protecting you, and it nearly cost us everything. I didn't want to take your choice away. You'd earned the right to tell me yourself. I only wanted you to know, when you did, that I was already here, that I'd been here the whole time." The days that followed were transformed. Not easy, because there is nothing easy about cancer treatment, but no longer lonely, and that made all the difference in the world. Marcus rearranged his work so that he drove Elena to every remaining appointment. He sat in the waiting rooms she had sat in alone. He learned the names of her nurses and her doctor, the real doctor, whose name turned out indeed to be Julian, an oncologist in his 60s with kind eyes, and Marcus laughed until he cried when he realized the name that had nearly ended his marriage belonged to a grandfather of 6. He held Elena's hand during the hard treatments and held her hair, what remained of it, on the sick nights, and he told her every single day that she was beautiful, and he meant it more fiercely each time. He told Sophie the truth, in the gentlest terms a 10-year-old could hold, that her mother was sick, but fighting hard, and that their whole job now was to love her loudly. And Sophie, who had her mother's stubborn chin, appointed herself chief nurse and drew her mother pictures of the two of them growing old together and taped them to the refrigerator, where Elena could see them from the kitchen table. Theodore came often now, and something had thawed between the two men. A bridge finally built across a canyon 12 years wide. The old man would sit with Marcus on the porch in the evening cold and say little, but the silence between them had changed its nature entirely. Once, Theodore put a hand on Marcus's shoulder and said, "You're a better man than I ever gave you credit for." And Marcus said, "I had to nearly lose everything to become him." And Theodore nodded as though that were the truest thing anyone had ever said, because he, who had lost his own wife years before, knew exactly what it cost. The treatment worked. It was long and brutal, and there were setbacks and terrible weeks. But 8 months after that Sunday morning in the kitchen, Elena's oncologist told them the words they had prayed for: in remission. Marcus held his wife in the parking lot of the cancer center. The same parking lot where she had once sat alone and terrified, and they cried together in the open daylight where anyone could see, and neither of them cared who did. Marcus never did throw away the divorce petition. Though Patricia Vance had shredded her copy, he kept the single page he had signed, folded in the back of his notebook, not as a wound, but as a warning. He would take it out sometimes and look at his own shaking signature, and he would remember how close he had come to ending 12 years of marriage over silence, over assumption, over the terrible things we build in the dark when we refuse to ask the people we love a simple question. He kept it to remind himself that the most dangerous distance between two people is not anger. It is the space filled with everything left unsaid. So let me ask you, wherever you are watching from tonight, how often do we look at the people closest to us and see betrayal where there is only fear, coldness where there is only love trying to protect us in the wrong way? How many marriages end, not because the love has died, but because two people were each too afraid to speak the truth that would have saved them? Marcus Bellamy nearly lost his wife twice, once to a disease and once to his own silence. And it was only by accident, by an inhaler left on a kitchen counter, that he learned the difference between the two. The lesson Marcus carried for the rest of their long life together was this: love is not proven in the grand gesture or the easy season. It is proven in the willingness to ask the hard question, to hear the frightening answer, and to say, "I am here," without conditions and without pride. Strength hidden to protect another is not strength at all. It is only a wall, and walls, as any engineer will tell you, can bear great weight until suddenly they cannot. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because I share stories like this one every week, stories about ordinary people and the extraordinary courage it takes to truly love another person. And tell me in the comments, has there been a moment in your own life when the truth turned out to be the opposite of what you feared? I read every single one, and I would be honored to hear yours. Take care of the people you love. Ask them the hard questions, and never let the silence do your talking for you.